everybody. This is going to be 7.1 through a good chunk of 7.3. We're going to get up to the Civil War, basically. And I've edited out a lot, so this is the good parts version. So let's look at 7.1, Slavery Dividing the Nation. We're going to start with a quote from Abraham Lincoln, who said in 1858, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Now, let's look at different perspectives on the issue of slavery. So, the North and South were growing very differently up through the Civil War. In the North, it was a lot of cities and technology and immigration. In the South, it was a lot more farm-based. It was a lot more based on agrarian lifestyles. Cotton was the main crop. And in general, labor was mainly provided by enslaved African Americans. The big question became, after the Mexican-American War, which we covered last chapter, what comes next? What happens as we move west? And so, for instance, here's all the land and grain that we got from Mexico. And so the question becomes, does that become enslaved land? Does that become free land? What do we do with that land, basically? And so the question arose, what do we do? One man who came up with a possible answer was David Wilmot. David Wilmot was a Pennsylvania congressman who proposed the Wilmot Proviso, where he said we should ban slavery in any of the land that we got from Mexico. That's an important term right there, the Wilmot Proviso. And the House, it passed the House where the North had more power. However, it was voted down in the Senate, I believe, 3 times. Now, though slavery was outlawed in the North, it's not like every single Northerner was an abolitionist. Many Northerners were still prejudiced. Some were still racist. They at least feared that a freed African American populace would come up and steal their jobs. Now, there were a very few abolitionists, like William Jennings Bryan and like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and guys like that. However, I'm sorry, not William Jennings Bryan, but Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. That's what I was thinking of. Some believe that abolition should be done immediately, and some believed it should be done slowly over time. Some even said that we should colonize the African Americans. However, many whites in the North still got their money from trade with the South, so many whites in the North were okay with slavery because it was a business venture for them. Now, let's look at slavery's impact in 1848 in the elections. So, in 1848, one of the biggest issues was the issue of slavery. The 2 big parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, really didn't want to talk about it very much because as soon as you took a stand on slavery, you were going to lose half of your party probably, one way or another. However, there were new political parties who were coming out with slavery as their main issue, and that meant that they had to talk about it a little bit. And this also, we see that it stopped being a party issue. It was not like Democrats were pro-slavery and Whigs were anti-slavery. It was the North was anti-slavery and the South was pro-slavery. It was becoming a geographic issue. And so slavery ended up dividing the Democrats and the Whigs north by south. Now, in 1848, we see a new party coming up that called for the halting of slavery where it was, not letting it expand further, and this is the Free Soil Party. They emerged in favor of the Wilmot Proviso and keeping slavery out of the West. They only got about 10% of the popular vote, but that's not nothing, especially for a first-time third party. And so this showed that the idea of keeping slavery out of the West might be popular among certain groups. Democrats proposed instead the idea of popular sovereignty, and this is, again, another important term that you're going to want to know. This is people in the territories, not Congress, should get to vote on whether or not their states were slave or free, and they should do it on a state-by-state basis. And in 1848, the Whigs won. General Zachary Taylor won basically by doing the Andrew Jackson thing. No one ever lost by putting forward a popular winning general, and that's exactly what Zachary Taylor was. He had very little political experience and didn't really reveal his beliefs on slavery. He ran as a war hero. So here's our 12th president, Zachary Taylor, president from 1849 to 50 when he died in office. He was from Virginia, but lived a lot of his life in Louisiana and all over the place. He was a former general in the U.S. Army, known as the Hero of Buena Vista from the Mexican-American War. And he died in office allegedly from drinking contaminated water, or bad cherries or iced milk or something like that. However, they dug him up in the 20th century to make sure it wasn't murder, and it turns out that it wasn't murder. Now, let's look at the Compromise of 1850. So, in 1849, California wanted to become a state in the United States. And we really wanted them to be a state in the United States because they had gold. However, the problem is that this would wreck the Missouri Compromise. One way or another, California would be an unequal state, and they were going to become a slave state, or a free state, I'm sorry. The South feared that this would irreparably tip the balance of power against them. So, Henry Clay, you all remember Henry Clay. He's been around since the War of 1812. He's the great compromiser. He has been holding this union together with two hands for the past 40 years. He, one last time, goes in and creates a compromise that's going to, he hopes, save and preserve the Union. It's basically the last thing he does before he dies in 1852. And in the end, he creates what is called the Compromise of 1850, where California would enter the Union as a free state. The North would agree to help capture runaway enslaved people, and the Western states would be able to use popular sovereignty to decide their status as slave or free states. So here's Henry Clay speaking in front of Congress, along with Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun. All three of these great, leaders of the House and the Senate for the past 40 years would all be dead by 1852. So the Compromise of 1850 would, at least people hoped a lot, keep the Union together. The new president, Millard Fillmore, supported this compromise. And so here's what everybody got. Here are the main points. So the big things are California got to be a free state. Popular sovereignty in the western states would decide whether they would be slave or free states. There would be a much stronger fugitive slave law. We'll get to that in a hot second. But also, they would get rid of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but not slavery itself. I guess they figured maybe it would die out on its own or something like that. Now, the biggest part of this compromise, like I said, is the Fugitive Slave Act. It required Northern citizens, it required them to assist in catching runaway slaves. Any citizen helping a fugitive slave escape would be subject to fines or imprisonment. And so even American Northern citizens who were not huge fans of abolition really didn't like being told what to do by the South. And as we're going to see, a lot of Northerners reacted very negatively to it. So, by the way, we have a new president, Millard Fillmore, 1850 to 53 from New York. He was a former congressman and a former vice president, the last Whig president. He is not the world's most interesting guy. One historian actually said to discuss Millard Fillmore is to overrate him. Ouch. So, let's look at the pushback against slavery. The Compromise of 1850 was meant to sort of ease tensions. However, it didn't have the impact that they wanted. Like I said, even Northerners who aren't abolitionists didn't like being told what to do. Many Northern states passed personal liberty laws saying that they had the right, as states in the North, to block this national fugitive slave law. An interesting use of states' rights right here. Some northern cities took it a step further and actively worked against the slave hunters. So, for instance, Christiana, Pennsylvania, a fugitive slave was captured and imprisoned in Christiana, and a group of white and African-American citizens actually brought out guns and defended this runaway slave, killed the slave owner, and refused to assist the slave catchers. This is not the only time that happened, by the way. Many Northerners, including former slaves, created what's called the Underground Railroad, which was a network of safe houses and escape routes, trying to get enslaved people to Canada or to Mexico, which were both free of slavery and therefore more safe than the United States. One of the most famous conductors probably was an ex-slave woman named Harriet Tubman, who got the nickname Moses for leading her people to freedom. She led hundreds of slaves into freedom. And so here are some of the routes of the Underground Railroad. You might notice that St. Louis is prominent on that Underground Railroad map. Allegedly, many cities or many houses along the riverside had tunnels that led from the river to the houses. So here is Harriet Tubman. She was born Araminta Ross. She lived from 1822 to 1913 from Maryland, where she was an abolitionist, a former enslaved person, member of the Underground Railroad. She was a scout during the Civil War and a political activist for women's rights after the war. She also led men into battle during the Civil War, which makes her, again, a precedent in the Combahee River Raid. Here, by the way, is the secret passage where an enslaved person could hide. This is in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, we also see some other famous abolitionist authors who are using their books to sort of call for changes to slavery. We have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which portrayed slaves as kind, sympathetic. However, some eventually came to view the people in her books as too submissive, a little too willing to please their white owners. Somebody who was not so willing to do this was Martin Delany, an African-American author who wrote a book called Blake about an enslaved man who chooses to become a violent rebel instead against slavery. In response to this, white Southerners wrote their own, I have to say, not as popular books, which showed how delightful and kind slave owners were and how happy enslaved people were to be enslaved. It didn't sell as well. So here's Harriet Beecher Stowe, 1811 to 1896, from Connecticut, from the powerful Beecher family of abolitionists. She was an author and an abolitionist, and her family, like I said, were prominent in the abolition movement. It's possible that she was a conductor on the Underground Railroad as well, and she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin based upon real people that she met who were escaping during this time. Now, let's look at 7.2, violence escalating. Roger Taney, ruling on Dred Scott, said they, meaning African Americans, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. We will get to that in just a moment. But first, let's get to Bleeding Kansas. So, we decided that the West would get to decide whether they were going to be slave or free states. And in 1854, Stephen Douglas of Illinois put this into practice. He proposed that the Nebraska Territory be split into Kansas and Nebraska, two separate states. He also proposed that the people of each state would get to choose for themselves whether or not they wanted slavery. This is, again, the idea of popular sovereignty. Now, this seemed to Douglas like a nice way of dealing with the slavery issue. However, it would have long-term disastrous results leading up to the Civil War. So, here is Stephen Douglas, 1813 to 1861, lived most of his life in Illinois, even though he was born in Vermont. He was a congressman and a senator and ran for president before dying in 1861. And he and Abraham Lincoln were competitors in many things, not least of which was for to become the husband of Miss Mary Todd, although Abraham Lincoln won that particular competition. Now, most politicians thought that Kansas would become a slave state, Nebraska would become free, and it would sort of work itself out. That balance would work itself out. And so Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, saying that popular sovereignty should be used in Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas completely ignored the fact that both of these states are above the 3630 Missouri Compromise line, and he basically said, forget it. Forget the Missouri Compromise. It's over. From now on, we're going to use popular sovereignty, not a line. So the problem was that this caused both pro and anti-slavery men to go rushing into Kansas and voting either for slavery or for freedom, trying to swing this vote. In the end, it went both sides basically declared victory. Kansas ended up with two constitutions and two state capitals. And so two groups sent petitions to Congress, one for Kansas to become a slave state, one for Kansas to become a free state. It was a mess. And then the mess got violent. In 1856, Pro-slavery men raided the town of Lawrence, which was the abolitionist stronghold where the University of Kansas is today, and they burned it to the ground. In response to this, John Brown, a radical abolitionist, and his sons dragged 5 pro-slavery men out of their beds and hacked them to death with broadswords. Soon after this, Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas. So, by the way, here's John Brown. We're going to meet him later. 1850 to 59, born in Connecticut, but moved everywhere. He was a long-term failed businessman in a bunch of different places, and he was, like I said, an extreme abolitionist. He believed that God had appointed him to end slavery, and we'll see him again in Harper's Ferry, but with a beard. Now, violence was not just in Kansas. Violence spread to the Senate, where Charles Sumner, an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, gave a fiery speech calling out the South as evil and pernicious and responsible for the blood flow in Kansas. And he even pointed specifically at one guy named Andrew Butler and said, "You, sir, this is your fault." In response, the next day, Andrew Butler's son-in-law, a congressman by the name of Preston Brooks, walked up behind Charles Sumner in the Senate and whacked him over the head with his cane several times to the point where Charles Sumner nearly died, and he did suffer permanent brain damage. Brooks got new canes from Southern admirers that had "hit him again" etched into them. So here is Preston Brooks attacking Charles Sumner in a political cartoon. And here's the actual seat where it happened in the old Senate building in Washington, D.C. This is in the basement of the U.S. Capitol today. Now, let's also look at regional tension. By the mid-1850s, American politics had mainly broken down over North versus South. And so the regional tension destroyed the Whig Party. Northern Whigs were not fans of the Fugitive Slave Law. Southern Whigs were not fans of California entering as a free state. The two sides couldn't join together, and so they broke up instead. And in 1852, the Whigs realized that all their best politicians had died. So they ran another war hero. They ran Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican War, and lost to Franklin Pierce. And that was more or less the end of the Whigs right there. They could not hold it together after this. They were divided by the slavery issue. By the way, here's Franklin Pierce. We're going to roughly go through him because, well, everyone else doesn't cover him very much. So he was president from 53 to 57 from New Hampshire, where he was a congressman and a senator, and not known for many things except for being drunk. He once fainted in the saddle occasionally, allegedly. And while many soldiers were known to be the winner of many a hard-fought battle, he was known to be the winner of many a hard-fought bottle, according to his critics. Now, a new party formed in the 1850s. It was partially based on this anti-slavery faction of the Whigs that had gone. It attracted some Democrats who were against slavery. It attracted Free Soilers. It attracted many different groups, and they sort of coalesced into the Republican Party. And so by 1856, they were powerful enough to run a candidate for president, and they did. Now, in 1856, the Republicans chose John C. Fremont. Fremont was firmly anti-slavery. He lost to James Buchanan. Buchanan had not been part of the slavery issue because he'd been off in England. However, he made the promise that he would stop sort of poking at slavery. It wasn't a bad try. The Republicans actually did pretty well for themselves, considering that they were a first-time political presidential party. But James Buchanan became president. Buchanan was president from 1857 to 1861 from Pennsylvania. He had been a congressman and a senator, the former Secretary of State, and had been minister to Great Britain, which is probably what got him this job. He is also, so far as now, our only president who has remained unmarried for his entire life. Now, the one thing that came out of this time period is the Dred Scott decision, and this is a big one, and it's also right here from Missouri. Here's the story of Dred Scott. The Supreme Court heard this case. Dred Scott was an enslaved person from St. Louis, Missouri. He sued for his freedom because his owner had taken Dred Scott to Illinois and then all the way up to Wisconsin, which were both free territories. And he had remained enslaved even while he was on free soil. Eventually, the Supreme Court, after hearing arguments, ruled against Dred Scott. They said that all slaves were property. They said all African Americans, slave or free, were not citizens and could never be citizens. And then Roger Taney, the Chief Justice, took this one step further in his decision and made a huge statement by saying the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Wow. First of all, that had nothing to do with this case. Taney basically said, I'm gonna, draw the line right here. I'm gonna decide the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise, and he did it. And boy, it sent a shockwave through the nation. So here, by the way, is Dred Scott, 1799 to 1858. He moved throughout the country. He spent the last part of his life in St. Louis, where he was an enslaved person. He also ended up being a hotel porter after being freed. He was freed by a white family after he lost the case, although unfortunately he did not live very long afterward. He died shortly afterward of tuberculosis. He is still buried in St. Louis's own Calvary Cemetery. You can go visit his gravestone. And Roger Taney said, what Dred Scott's master might lawfully do with Dred Scott in the free state of Illinois, every other master may lawfully do with any other 1 or 1,000 slaves in Illinois or any other free state. Wow. This is considered by many people to be the worst decision that the Supreme Court has ever made. Now, let's look at the continuation of violence as well. John Brown. Remember John Brown? Guy with no beard who's about to have a scary beard? He went about trying to free the slaves in his own way. He believed that he was being called by God to end slavery, and he was willing to use violence to achieve this. And so in 1859, John Brown decided that he was going to build up an army and attack the South, where he hoped to end slavery. So here's John Brown in 1859, now with a terrifying beard. So, John Brown and 21 of his followers attacked Harper's Ferry in Virginia, which is now actually in West Virginia. They hoped to free the local slaves, create a slave army, and take this army south to destroy slavery. However, it never got out of Harper's Ferry. He was almost immediately surrounded. His small band of followers was mainly shot and killed, although a few survived. Brown himself was wounded and was taken into custody, where he was captured, tried, and sentenced to death for treason. Now, many people in the South saw this as justice. However, his death made him a martyr to the North. John Brown became almost Christ-like to some. And from the gallows, where he was about to be hung, he wrote a note and passed it to a jailer who said, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. And so here he is being led to the gallows to be hung. Now let's briefly look at the first part of 7.3. Abraham Lincoln in 7.3 says, in great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. Now let's look at the election of 1860. This is where we're going to stop, too. So the Democrats really couldn't decide who they were going to nominate to become president. There was significant division among the Northern and Southern Democrats. Eventually, when Stephen Douglas became the Northern Democrats' choice, the Southerners simply walked out of the convention and held their own. So now we got two Democrats running for president. We got Stephen Douglas, and we have John Breckinridge of Kentucky, who is running for the South. Meanwhile, a new party called the Constitutional Union Party was formed with the sole purpose of keeping the Union together at all costs. And they put out their own presidential nominee, a guy named John Bell of Tennessee. And so there were four candidates running for president in 1860. Here, by the way, is the banner for the Constitutional Union Party. Now, in Chicago, the Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln, who seemed like a weird choice a little bit to become their nominee for president. First of all, he was a one-term congressman. He was not as well known as other people running. However, he had very recently made a name for himself by a series of debates he had with Stephen Douglas, while running for the Senate in 1858. Now, he may not have gotten that Senate seat, but what he did get was a lot of good press. He also beat out a lot of other famous nominees, partially because he didn't have this sort of record of abolitionism to his name. He was seen as a moderate, somebody who was willing to compromise and deal. And Lincoln had said that he wanted to stop the spread of slavery. He didn't want it to head any further west. However, he was not going to call for the abolition of slavery. Now, in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won, but he split the difference with four other people, meaning he only got about 40% of the vote. He received nothing from the South. In fact, he didn't even appear on the ballot in the South. This election really showed how divided our nation had become over this issue of slavery. Southerners were very worried that the election of Lincoln was going to take our country in a radical anti-slavery direction. So here we see, again, just how divided our country was geographically, North versus South. We see Lincoln winning the North, Breckinridge winning the South, Bell winning the middle, the compromise middle states, and Stephen Douglas winning Missouri and a few votes out of New Jersey. Now we have our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 1865, born in Kentucky, but moved to Indiana and spent a lot of his life in Illinois, where he was a state congressman 4 times, and he was a congressman to the U.S. House of Representatives for 1 term for 2 years. Lincoln is our tallest president. He's also our first president, sadly not our last, to die by assassination. Now, let's look at the collapse of the Union during this time. So, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Southerners met to discuss the possibility of leaving the United States, and this is known as secession. South Carolina was the first to declare that they had done this in December of 1860. This was before Lincoln was even president. In the next few weeks, 6 other states left. So in all, 7 states left before Lincoln had even taken the oath of office. In total, 11 states would secede from the Union. So in February of 1861, these states who claimed that they had left formed what was called the Confederate States of America. They wrote their own constitution, which mirrored the U.S. Constitution in a lot of ways, except there were a couple of clauses that said that the states had more rights than the federal government, and it especially focused on the right of slavery being specifically enumerated, unlike in the U.S. Constitution. The only president of the Confederacy was Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, former senator and secretary of war. So here are the 11 Confederate States of America. Now, in March, when Abraham Lincoln became president, he appealed directly to the South. In his opening speech, he promised that he was not trying to interfere with slavery where it was. He was just trying to stop it from spreading. He also pointed at the South and said, if we're going to have a war, this is on you guys, not on me. I'm not starting any war. You all are starting a war. And as these southern states continued to leave the Union, they started to seize American territory throughout the South, especially forts. The one last holdout was Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. In fact, it was on an island in the middle of Charleston. It was surrounded by Confederates, but neither side wanted to fire that first shot to start this war. Here is Fort Sumter, an island in the middle of South Carolina. Eventually, the fort ran low on supplies, and Lincoln sent a ship to resupply them, although he made it explicitly clear he was not going to rearm them. However, the South viewed this as an attack, and that was that. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War began when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter. A day and a half later, Fort Sumter surrendered. This was the beginning of the Civil War. It was a bloodless start to the bloodiest war we've ever had in America. Both sides were energized by the attack, and both sides called for volunteers to join the army to fight the opposing side. Both sides, however, also expected that this was going to be a very short war. We're actually going to see that it takes for the first real battle to disparage this idea. And so here is Fort Sumter being attacked. We will get to the rest of this in our next section.